Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to talk to everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today I'm joined by guest Kirk Schmidt to talk about analytics. Kirk, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Kurt, for those of my listeners that don't know you very well, can you give a brief intro of who you are?
Sure. So right now I am the Director of Fundraising Optimization for Frontier Marketing. I have been in the charitable sector since 2007. I've either been a fundraiser or kind of fundraising adjacent, running different nonprofit operations, or consulting in terms of the operations, systems, analytics space. The stuff I do that's probably the most public is I do a lot of work in metrics and analytics in the charitable sector, especially trying to improve the types of metrics that we use so that we can fundraise better.
Let's start by a definition then, because I get confused between metrics and analytics. Are they more or less the same? Is there mostly overlap, but there are nuances between them? How would you define metrics and how would you define analytics?
Yeah, I usually talk about metrics and analytics as as a group, because that way I don't have to worry about the definitions so much. It's kind of this whole environment of measuring and applying different things. But really, metrics, kind of at a base level, is the actual measurement, the actual production of some value based on a number of inputs. Whereas analytics is really more about the process of looking at that data, analyzing that data, and trying to come up with some sort of conclusion or story based on that data.
So if I were to reframe it, then metrics is just the gathering of data and the analytics is then processing it, or would you define it just if I were to take it a much more simpler approach?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it.
Okay. So why is it important? Like, what would you, before we get to the why it's important, what would you measure first? What would you start with first, I should say? Would you start with the metrics first or analytics, or you just have to look at it holistically to say, okay, well, we have these metrics, now let's do some analysis on them to figure out what we can do and what information we can gain from this data?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, because you really can't analyze anything if you haven't measured anything, but sometimes it's the process of figuring out what you want to measure that will help you determine what you will measure. So quite often what will happen is you'll just start measuring some basic thing. And in the fundraising world, that could be something as simple as, what gifts you're getting in, how much money you're getting per year, how many gifts each donor is giving, those types of things. And usually what ends up happening is you start looking at the data, you start looking for trends and patterns and that type of thing, and you start finding yourself asking, oh, this is really interesting. What if this, or why is this? And it's usually those questions that help determine what you should be measuring next, or what you should be looking for next. And then it kind of goes through this circular process.
And the topic then of donors, is there any list of questions that you normally find a nonprofit should ask themselves, or do you help nonprofits to figure out what the questions should be? Or is it intuitive? Is it once you start looking at the data, a nonprofit will right away come up with the questions and then ask it themselves?
I think some of it's intuitive. I think sometimes there's good questions to ask that people don't necessarily think about. Usually the initial questions when it comes to donors are, how long are they being retained for? How do they typically engage with your organization? So is it all philanthropic? Is it all these types of things? What time of the year do they tend to respond? Those will be some of the initial pieces. And then usually you start going down the pathway of, well, where do they live? What do they like? And you start playing in more demographic and psychographic measures where you're starting to try to determine who your donors are fundamentally, so that you can better solicit them for gifts or better serve them if you're doing programs. And so it's kind of this circular piece where you really start with this very basic, like, what kind of information can I get from my database without thinking outwardly, and then over time going, what other information can I gather, and what other information can I infer?
Is there a typical moment where it makes sense to start looking at this data? Like, is it from day one, or have you seen situations where nonprofits are gathering this data but not really looking at it, and then one point saying, let's look under the hood and see what we have, and then making decisions from there?
I would say the most likely scenario that I see are our charities are effectively gathering data uh, in some small degree, like in a CRM, uh, but they're missing out on a lot of opportunity to tie other data that they have together. So usually they'll run different programs. So for example, in Canada we, as you know, like there are raffles and things like that. So sometimes you'll have charities that have people who do raffles and people who do silent auction and people who give gifts, and none of those data sets are combined. So usually that initial piece is people realizing that, oh, we should probably start to know more about how things work collectively. But usually, in an ideal situation, every charity is at least looking at their data and making some sort of decisions based on that. But in reality, what usually ends up happening is several years down the road, once there's some level of sophistication, once giving is far more common and they're making more money off of fundraising, that's when they start to look at and go, oh, we have this data here that we've been gathering for all of these years. Maybe we should do something with it.
And I imagine, CRM, of course, usually ends up being the hub, the center of a nonprofit in terms of keeping track of their donors. But I imagine there's other situations where donors could be in various other systems not connected directly to CRM that you would want to leverage that data as well. So in terms of having a full picture end to end, do you normally recommend, or do you normally see nonprofits pulling data into the CRM first and then doing reporting and analytics from there? Or is there another system that all these systems connect to that then does that holistic type of reporting?
Yeah, it really depends on the charity and a lot of the policies around some of that data. So there's a few different ways that it can be done. One is to have a database of record, which is usually the CRM that everything flows into. If it is capable of that type of sophistication. A lot of CRMs that we see in the charitable sector do still have problems with importing data or bringing in from other sources. And so you have to look to other possibilities. So some organizations will create data warehouses or data lakes, which are basically these places where data from all the different systems go into at once, and they'll create basically these profiles for the different data set to go in and what data can go in. So for example, when I worked for a large health charity, we had some information that we could put into a data lake, but there's a lot of information we could not put in because of health policies and privacy policies. So basically, we were able to take some systems and we were able to push a little bit of data from system A, and we were able to push a lot more data from system B because we didn't have some of the same restrictions. So there's different ways you can do it, either kind of in one system that everybody can go into, or those cases where you're dealing with much more kind of data, like these data lakes, data warehouses, these big data sets that everything kind of gets dumped into and analyzed from there.
I imagine also you have to have certain skill sets to not only get the data into that data warehouse or data lake, but also to be able to get some meaningful data out of it. Like I guess a data scientist or a data architect of some kind would be, or at least someone who has a lot of data experience, let's say, to be able to say, okay, now that we have all this data, let's now see some trends in it. Or
there is a level of sophistication involved with actually now taking the data and putting it together, but I'm not sure that it always has to be, say, somebody like me who went to school for mathematics. There's an entire process that we use called exploratory data analysis, which quite often is the process of taking a couple of pieces of information and putting them into a chart and seeing if you spot anything offhand that might be interesting. So, for example, you might put into a chart, how many people gave a third gift, and you might look at it as, what's the length of time between the first gift and the second gift, and you put those into a chart, and then you start to see, oh, look, it's actually creating a pretty solid line here. There is obviously some sort of relationship here. And so you can do that without a lot of experience in data science or a lot of understanding of, say, the base statistics. You can do these exploratory data graphs with some tools like Tableau or Microsoft Power BI. There's these programs that will allow you to do things like that. So that's one way you can approach it that doesn't require the statistical rigor that you might associate with most data analysis.
Does it matter the size of the nonprofit? I mean, we're talking about a CRM, data warehouse, data lakes, Power BI. These I've seen it in my experience at least. You need to be a nonprofit of a certain size to be able to leverage all these tools. Can nonprofits use them, or smaller nonprofits use them as well, or do you normally see a smaller sized scope for smaller nonprofits?
Usually, if you're using smaller data sets, you're probably using something like Excel. Excel's not gonna tank your system if you're talking about a few thousand records. There are some pieces of data you can get out of it. Some they won't be as sophisticated, and they probably won't have the level of what we would say confidence in them. So it's the type of thing where when you have large data sets, you can start to look at it and go, oh, like we know that this case is better than this case, and we know it with this level of confidence. You probably don't have that as a smaller nonprofit. You're probably going to go and look and go, oh, look, we tend to get gifts around the $80 mark, and you're going to find that in Excel, and it's going to be good enough. In the end, you're not looking for perfection in a lot of this data analysis you're doing. You're looking for guidance.
So let's say a nonprofit is starting a new fundraising campaign or a market outreach. This kind of information, of course, would be vital for a fundraiser or a marketing a campaigner. Is there key pieces of information you would say that matter more than others? Like, is it about the last time they donated or donated size, or it really depends on what they're trying to achieve, and then just ask for that kind of data?
I think a lot of thought needs to go in when you're starting a campaign in terms of what are you expecting to happen? Like really that hypothesis stage. What do we expect to happen, and what is the goal of this? And a really good example is there are some campaigns that you expect not to make money in the first few years. You basically, the point of the campaign might be specifically advertising. It might be specifically in terms of acquiring donors, but not necessarily like knowing that you might not pay for the campaign. For example, if you were to start, a brand new radiothon in a city, you might be inclined to go like, look, it's going to cost, tens of thousands of dollars to run this thing. We have to create all of these assets. We have to do all of these things. We know that we're probably not going to raise a lot of money this first year, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to set this up for future years. We're trying to acquire donors. We're trying to get out in the community, all of these things. And these are different goals than necessarily money. So going in, understanding that you might have goals that are maybe not just the straight, like how much money did it make and how much money did we get per donor, and how there's these goals that you can create. So I think that's really important first off. And then really if you're building a new campaign and you're looking for a particular response from people, then you have to think about like what is going to solicit that response. What are the things that you are going to have to do in order to make that happen? You might look at it and go, we have a total goal of $10,000 to raise. Are you going to raise that by talking to 1,000 people and you only need one donor to give 10,000? Is it that you are going to try to acquire 10,000 donors who each give $1? You need to think about kind of what that makeup looks like, and what are the things that make that happen.
I think going past just the dollar value is important as well, especially when you're trying to communicate with your donors. Having a certain level of personalization, I think, would be key. Knowing the person's pronouns, making sure the messaging strengthens that, reinforces that, and then making it the message in general as personal as possible, saying, I noticed you guys, or you donated X dollars on this date X months ago. We're hoping that you can, recontribute toward the same campaign. All this, I imagine, also can be leveraged from proper metrics and analytics.
Absolutely. And some of it comes down to what that cost is going to be of that personalization, right? In an ideal world, we would be able to talk to every donor in the ideal way that they like to be talked to, address the way that they like to be talked to, providing the level of information that they feel is really ties them to the organization, the type of appeal that are they the type of people who respond better to more statistical, like here's the data versus the emotional appeal. If in an ideal case, we would know that for every donor and we'd be able to apply that for every donor. But of course, your let's say it's a print campaign, your printing cost is going to go through the roof because you're basically talking about a different mail piece for every single donor. And so some of it comes down to you have to look at what is going to be the cost of personalization versus what is the expected, the expected gain from that. What's the expected lift from that personalization, and is it worth it? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you're really just trying to measure both the revenue and potential revenue and the cost, and look at, does this make sense?
In the same theme, in terms of being able to measure things and use it, have you seen anything that can't really be measured but is important?
Yeah, there's a few things that, and I don't want to say they can't be measured. I would say that we have not determined a good way to measure or a good proxy for them yet. And maybe there isn't a way to measure just based on how it goes. But I think one of the big things for charities always is, what is the effect of certain fundraising activities on the other fundraising activity? So some of these we know, and there's been a lot of research into, for example, multi-channel campaigns, in terms of, if you send an email 2 weeks before the print piece lands on their door, we know that this particular effect is likely to happen. There's been research into that. But if you have an annual event and it's a big gala and only 1,000 people attend, but it tends to get a lot of press, and it tends to it tends to be the who's who of the place you're in. Does having that event and the effect of it, what we would say in economics, the positive externalities of it, do they affect the mailing campaign that you send three months later? And really the only way to properly measure that would be to live in two different alternate universes, and having one with the event and one with not, and you would measure and look at the differences that way. But short of being caught in Loki, you're basically having to try to guess to what some of these effects are. So that's kind of one of the big ones for me. The other one that always gnaws on my mind is knowing when the ideal time to ask a donor is, or when the ideal time to engage with the donor, and what that engagement looks like. I feel like that's a little bit more possible in terms of some of its measurement, but it's still very, like, we don't know day to day, short of following people's lives like they're in The Sims, what they're thinking that particular day and what they're going to respond to a particular day. Whereas, if we could know that to some level and go like, look, if we send them, just a simple like, hey, just, want to thank you again for the gift 3 months ago, to know that will have an effect that will lift donation later. And I think that's almost a bit of the holy grail in terms of fundraising, is knowing what to send to a donor, in what way, at what time, in order to maximize fundraising.
I love the Loki reference. I read a book called How to Measure Anything by Douglas W. Hubbard. And one of the principles that he was presenting was that even though you can't necessarily measure to 100% accuracy, there is something to be said about ranges and percentage of accuracy. Do you think there's some validity to that statement? And have you ever seen something like that in practice? Because I like the examples of saying we don't necessarily know the impacts of a multi-channel campaign or when is the ideal time to engage with a donor, but is there a way of measuring it to a certain degree of accuracy?
Yeah, I think there's ways to look at data that will be helpful. So for example, when I talked about that gala, there's theoretically some ways that you could look at, what are the circles of influence that the people who attend the event are in. Like, are they related to some of the other donors? Do they happen to donate also when this mail campaign happens 3 months later? Like, there are things that you can measure and go like, do we see an effect? A really good example of this is, we know that when we send out print media, quite often people will go online and donate, and they might not go onto the web page that you have a fancy QR code for. They're just going to go to the general website and donate. You can look at what the typical volume is at a particular time and look at, did that receive a lift, the week later because that's when mail would have dropped in their mailboxes and people gave. It's not that you're necessarily saying that all of that lift is due necessarily to the mail piece, but you're going like, look, we know that the mail piece will cause a certain lift with online because people will do that. Can we guesstimate what that amount is? So there's that level. And then the other thing is proxy variables. So quite often, if we don't know how to measure something, we might be able to measure something else that gives us an idea of what's going on, or might give us maybe some advanced knowledge over other data. An example of this, and it's a sad example, but an example of this is, we know that when the number of domestic abuse complaints increases, it is very likely that the economy is tanking. And you are likely to see quicker economic variables based on domestic abuse numbers than waiting for the core CPI, like the inflation rates, to come out and things like that. And so you can use certain variables or certain things that you see as ways of explaining things that you might not be able to measure directly.
But there also is a concern of creating causality versus causation, right? One might be fully independent of the other.
Absolutely. And there can be correlation, and it's not perfect, and the world is messy, even when we're doing A/B tests and closely controlling them. There are always some level of external factors that we don't think about, we don't anticipate. And it's the type of thing where what you're trying to do is really just create a level of, how comfortable are you looking at it and going like, look, that this is happening, so we also believe that this is happening, based on past history with correlation and that. But yeah, correlation and causation are it's one of those things where it's probably best not to assume that something causes the other. But if you can look at it and go, look, we know that when the price of oil is up, then these things tend to happen. It at least gives you some guidance.
Is there any danger then in looking at the data and coming up with different results? I imagine that famous saying that statistics can be massaged to the message that you want to communicate. And I imagine it's the same applies for metrics and analytics. You can, if you see a particular metric you don't like, there are ways to spin it for good or for evil, let's say, or at least maybe two people analyzing the same data might get different results and then want to proceed in different directions. What can be done about that, or should anything be done about that?
Yeah, I mean that's a bigger problem than you and me, but in general, for the most part, what I see when people are getting two different stories from the data, it comes down to two things. One is interpretation, and one is presentation. And so presentation is the easier thing to deal with. I'm sure you've seen plenty of arguments on the internet, because that's where you go to argue on things like climate change. And quite often you'll look at two data sets, and one person is looking at what has happened with climate over 5 years, and another is looking at what has happened with climate over 10,000 years. And you might derive a different conclusion from one of them simply because of the scope you're looking at, or the way it's presented. If you're looking at a chart of, say, your credit score, let's say you've got really good credit, and so you're sitting at, like, let's say the 750 range, but you're going between 745 and 755 on any given day. If the range on your chart is only 745 to 755, you're going to see these big movements up and down, these big peaks and valleys. Whereas if you zoom out and you look at it from the 0 to 800 range, it looks like a squiggle. And so presentation has a lot to do with how things get looked at. And even in terms of psychologically how we think about different data. Cost to raise a dollar is a major piece in fundraising. It is effectively a ratio of inputs versus outputs. So I spend 20 cents and I get a donor to give me $1 with that 20 cents. Return on investment is another metric that uses the exact same inputs and outputs, using revenue and expenses as its inputs, and it's spitting a number out. Now, if I told you that my mutual funds are making 100% per year, they're basically doubling every year. you'd basically want to get into those mutual funds because you know that you put a cent in now and 30 years later you're a multimillionaire. Um, that's compelling, 100% return on investment. But if I tell you that my charity has 50-cent cost to raise $1, people are likely up in arms going, what are you spending all of that money on? And yet it's the exact same number. It's just presented in two different ways because of the way that the ratio works. So a lot of it will come down to that presentation. How is the metric presented? How psychologically does that affect things? How is it shown on, say, charts? What is it compared to? A lot of it comes down to that. And then there's always interpretation problems. Again, this comes down to correlation and causation problems. Quite often when you're coming down to a conclusion, you're looking at it from a particular way, looking at this data, I assume this thing, and once you look at other data, you start to go, oh, my interpretation changes. A good example of this is overall retention rate. You might look at a database and go, oh man, their retention rate last year was incredible. They're doing fantastic. And what it turns out is they didn't do any acquisition the year before, and so because new donors acquired tend to not be retained at as high a rate as people who have been around for a while, all of a sudden your retention rate goes up, and it has nothing to do with anything you've done with stewardship or any type of retention. It has everything to do with, did you actually try to get new donors, and because you didn't, your retention rate is higher. What are the implications of that? The implication is that over time, you're going to just keep losing donors until you have none left. So it's about looking at those other variables, looking at the other things around it, and going, can I still be at the same conclusion knowing all of these other things? It's a big problem in terms of misinterpretation, and it usually has to do with, are you looking at big enough of a picture, and are you showing the data in a way that is intentionally misinterpreting?
Yeah, those are great points. And I totally agree with the presentation, because that 50% versus 200% or 0.5 and the 100% makes a big difference in how you perceive things. There's a common principle about loss aversion, where people are more afraid to lose $1 than gain $1. And that kind of bias and cognitive thinking can be leveraged, for good and for evil. You can make the same thing look really, really good, or you can make it look really, really bad.
Absolutely.
One thing I thought of as we're talking is going back a bit more to the project side of nonprofits. I've noticed, or I ask the question very often before I come in to do a particular project, is there a baseline? Before I can help, improve their fundraising or improve various elements within a nonprofit, I'd like to know what the starting point is. Is that something you also typically recommend, or are there any other KPIs, key performance indicators, that you would recommend a nonprofit have as they're moving toward a new project?
I think it's always important to have some base level of data that you kind of know what has been happening, and it's important to look more than 1 year. It's very easy to go, oh yeah, last year here's what our giving looked like, here's how many donors we had, but you don't know if last year was an anomaly or not. The last couple of years, there's pretty much some asterisks beside on most data analysis because of what happened during the pandemic, and so is the year you're looking at representative of general. So you're probably looking at more than 1 year. Depending on the project, it might depend on what you're looking at. Total giving is a good base metric. It has a lot going into it, and it's what's known as a lagging metric. So you can only measure it after the data is in. You can't really predict anything based on it. But you could look at things like that: number of donors, total giving. You could start looking at. I think it's always important to look at things like acquisition and retention rates, especially if you're bringing in a new channel or some new way of fundraising. Costs are always important. I don't usually like to say, this metric is the best metric and you should use it all the time, because it really does depend on the project. What I like to advise is using metrics that are unlikely to change when most of the data is unchanged. So, for example, average gift, I tend not to talk about a lot, because quite often what will happen is somebody will give a very large gift in a particular year, and average gift will skyrocket. And it doesn't really mean that most of the fundraising has changed. It just one gift happened to come in that was larger than expected. And so you want to look at measures that are unlikely to be affected. So you might do something when it comes to average. You might trim an average, or you might use median, or you might use something that is more indicative of what the typical experience is of the charity. So it's important to think about that. Think about what is happening from a trend perspective. In general, it does depend on the project, and it does depend on what you're trying to achieve. If you're doing something that will probably bring in a lot of donors but not a lot of money, total giving probably doesn't matter too much to you. It might be good to have, because if it happens to be a wild success, let's say you decide to go out and go on social media and just have somebody dump ice water on somebody else. You might want to know what your total revenue is before you do that. But I don't think the expectation of what you are going to raise is going to end up being millions upon millions of dollars out of nowhere. So it's important to go in going like, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve engagement with this? Are we trying to have this hashtag just show up enough times that we get advertising out of it? Then you look at the baselines based on that, and you might just have some other variables just in case you're the next ice bucket challenge.
Going back to having sufficient data, I imagine the pandemic obviously threw out and skewed all these numbers, especially if anybody or any nonprofit that started within the last few years. Because I did hear somewhere that quite a few did actually start during the pandemic. So it must be hard at that point to establish a baseline, or at least usually recommend putting the pandemic numbers into its own little bubble, like keeping it separate from everything else.
It's always hard when you start something to have data. And it doesn't matter if it's a charity or not. And I remember having an argument back in university about starting a group was starting a program, and we said, what do you expect to do out of this? They said, we can't know. It's a pilot project. And like, well, I can go onto Google for a few minutes and probably find other pilot projects that did well. So I think there's ways that you can look at data that doesn't necessarily need your own internal. You might look at what are like charities, what is the experience of organizations that started in a particular, like if your town, your city, whatever, has a particular geographic traits, whatever it is, there are ways that you can kind of look at it and go, here's what we expect to happen. But yeah, you won't have a lot of that internal data to baseline it and go, how are we going to do on this? And so you're effectively looking at, what is the first set of data you're getting in, and can that be a reasonable approximation to, what you're going to do if you scale this? And that's always the question, right? Is if we were to invest, 100 times as much as we invest in fundraising now, would this scale at that level? And when you're starting out, you might get a few gifts in, and it's because you happen to know some people and you were able to get them to give. It's probably not indicative of what's going to happen if you try to do a direct mail acquisition campaign. And so you have to just kind of borrow information where you can from other people, get advice from other people, and test. Run a smaller version and see what happens.
Kurt, this has been really insightful. Thank you for your information. Where can people find more about you online if they have additional questions they want to follow up on?
The easiest way to find me is LinkedIn. I typically don't do a lot of other social media, or if I do, it's pretty locked down. But you can find me, Kirk Schmidt. I work for Frontier Marketing, so if you can't find me by my name, which isn't the easiest to spell, feel free to look there. But LinkedIn is where I go. I post almost every day, and I'm always happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Alapa, and I hope you join me again next time for Agents of Nonprofit.